Wherever you are in the world, welcome to another edition of Jerry's Take on China. Fears of conflict over Taiwan dominated the recent G7 foreign ministers meeting in Sapporo. But are they really justified? China couldn't make it more clear that it wants reunification with Taiwan. Many in Taiwan agree, but many want to maintain the status quo. And for most of the last 70 years, up to and including today, China has accepted this. The view in China is that reunification is inevitable, not because the CPC want it, they do, but because the Chinese people want it. And if we're honest, that's called democracy. The problem is that much of the international community is not honest about what they want, or at least the international community as led by the USA. So let's just for a moment be honest about the USA's leadership. They control NATO, they control the United Nations, they control the G7, and they make rules to suit themselves, constantly calling on others to comply with international law, whilst at the same time, according to the United Nations, disregarding their own nation's human rights, whilst violating those of other nations. They've refused to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but they constantly invoke it when they're critical of China in the South China Sea. They've not only refused to comply with the International Criminal Court, but they've written their own law to protect American war criminals from that court. That law allows them to both sanction any International Criminal Court investigators who look into US war crimes, and even invade The Hague as part of a sovereign nation. That's unthinkable. The Netherlands wouldn't be happy. If an American is arrested by the ICC, that's what they'll do. Despite that, they support the ICC in any investigations related to Russia, including the recent warrant to arrest Putin. But they've never called for any investigations into Ukraine or their own war crimes. Double standards and a rules-based order are prevalent wherever the US meets, and their recent G7 foreign ministers meeting in Japan was no exception. Blinken made an appearance direct from Vietnam. Western media promoted the strength of the American-Vietnamese relationship, and they raised some fears over an imaginary alarm that Vietnam has about China's growing military. No evidence was given to support that fear, and no mention was made of the recent state visit by President Nguyen to China, where a joint statement on strengthening and deepening the cooperation between Vietnam and China was signed. But tellingly, Vietnam didn't even bother finding the US flag for the photo ops. Biden's phone call to Nguyen last month and now Blinken's trip was seemingly both designed to undermine that agreement. The G7 needs to be taken into context for what it is. It's a political body which does not, as many people believe, represent the top 7 global economies. If it did, Italy and Canada would be out, India and China would be in. India is perhaps the loser here. The only reason why the world's most populous democracy and number 5 on the list of top economies is not there is because they're too poor to be of benefit. China is different. It has an ideology that the US doesn't agree with, so it will be excluded at all costs. This group of 7 governments represents about 10% of the global population and 27% of the world's GDP. Let that sink in for a moment. 7 governments represent 0.8 billion people, and they control more than a quarter of the world's GDP. France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK were all colonial expansionists. They all enriched themselves at different times in their history by exploitation of their colonies. USA and Canada are settler colonialists, each with a history of genocide. Judge for yourself if these are the kinds of governments that care for world peace or the betterment of mankind. The G7 was set up initially in 1975 with a view to leading the world through an economic crisis, but it's changed its course. It's now a strategic planner of future developments. Unfortunately, their agreements do not benefit the developing world. In 2021, Under Biden's leadership, the G7 agreed to historic tax reforms, and the principle of that was that global tax of 15% would be applied on all businesses, so the ability to offshore companies to avoid taxes would be eliminated. 2 years later, this is still years away from implementation, and if implemented, developing nations will never benefit from this. In that same year, the B3W, Build Back a Better World initiative was launched, not to benefit the world, but to offset challenges from China and to provide an alternative to China's BRI. Even the White House said that. It would be nice if China's strategies in the underdeveloped world had spurred the rich leaders on to help mankind, but it didn't. B3W has achieved nothing. What it announced a year after its launch turned out to be nothing more than a number of ongoing projects which were moved under the umbrella of B3W. I recently reported about that in Pearls and Irritations. This foreign ministers' meeting in Sapporo did not benefit the global south at all. It was a meeting to benefit the 10% of the population that they represent. And for the US, consolidating its waning power over the Indo-Pacific, they want to safeguard greater compliance and cohesion from other members. It's clear that no matter what this meeting claims about unity, there are rifts. The usual platitudes about climate and energy were overshadowed by the release of treated water. That's a euphemism for nuclear wastewater into the ocean by the hosts, Japan. Japan also claims to be very concerned about this potential conflict over Taiwan, and the US claims it wants nothing other than the status quo to be maintained. However, the status quo isn't exemplified by increasing arms sales, making visits by senior politicians, putting training troops on the ground. If the status quo were returned to previous levels of a few years ago, there would be no talk of conflict. China has made it clear that conflict will be seen as a strategy failure and only necessary to prevent Chinese property being taken away by Western influence again. President Macron of France, controversially stating the quiet part out loud after his visit to China, suggested it would be wise not to be drawn into a conflict and Europe should reduce its reliance on the USA. He's perhaps the first, and in recent years only, member of the G7 to voice dissent since Charles de Gaulle upset NATO in 1963. Germany is currently embroiled in its own problems. It has many companies investing heavily in China, and Italy has signed a memorandum of understanding with the Belt and Road Initiative, the only one of G7 and only one of the few industrialized nations to have done so. In fact, about the only thing G7 members can agree on is an unreasonable and unwarranted fear from a rising China. And that's all we have time for tonight, so please like, share, subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you again in just a few days. Bye for now.